Everything you are about to hear is completely real and based on true historical events that unfolded during the Second World War. The images and videos shown throughout this documentary are generated using artificial intelligence only for illustrative purposes, to help visualize these actual events. What follows is the true story of the largest amphibious invasion in human history, an operation so audacious and complex that its success seemed almost impossible. Yet it succeeded and changed the course of the war forever. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, thousands of young men huddled in landing craft, pitching and rolling through the black waters of the English Channel. Most had never seen combat. Many were seasick, vomiting over the sides of their vessels or into their helmets. The roar of aircraft engines overhead mixed with the crash of waves against steel hulls. These men knew that in minutes they would storm beaches defended by the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. Many knew they would not survive the day. Yet they went forward anyway, because the freedom of Europe and perhaps the world depended on what happened in the next 24 hours. This was D-Day, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, and it remains the most consequential single day in modern military history. The story of D-Day begins not with the invasion itself, but with years of meticulous planning, deception, and preparation that made it possible. By early 1943, the strategic situation in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Soviet Union, bearing the overwhelming burden of fighting Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, was desperately calling for the Western Allies to open a second front that would force Hitler to divide his forces. Stalin had been promised such an invasion, but the Allies, particularly the British under Winston Churchill, had repeatedly delayed, citing the need for proper preparation and the ongoing campaigns in North Africa and Italy. Churchill remembered the disastrous Gallipoli campaign of the First World War and was haunted by the prospect of another failed amphibious assault. The Americans, led by General George Marshall and pressured by President Franklin Roosevelt, wanted to invade France as soon as possible. The compromise was to target the spring of 1944 for the cross-channel invasion. Command of the operation was given to General Dwight Eisenhower, a choice that surprised many. Eisenhower was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. He had never led troops in combat during the First World War and had spent most of his career in staff positions. But Eisenhower possessed qualities that proved far more valuable for this operation than tactical brilliance. He was a supreme diplomat and organizer, capable of managing the enormous egos and competing interests of Allied commanders, politicians, and military services. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would command ground forces during the initial phase, was vain, difficult, and convinced of his own genius. American generals like George Patton and Omar Bradley had their own strong opinions and rivalries. Eisenhower somehow held this fractious coalition together through charm, tact, and an absolute commitment to Allied unity. He understood that Overlord would succeed or fail not on the battlefield alone, but in the ability of Americans, British, Canadians, and other Allied nations to work together toward a common goal. The planning for Overlord was staggering in its complexity. The Allies needed to move over 150,000 men across the English Channel on the first day alone, along with thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and tons of supplies. They needed to establish a beachhead on hostile shores defended by German forces that had spent years building elaborate fortifications. They needed air superiority to protect the invasion fleet from German aircraft. They needed naval supremacy to deliver the troops and bombard German positions. They needed detailed intelligence about German defenses, beach gradients, tidal patterns, and coastal geography. And they needed to keep the entire operation secret while simultaneously deceiving the Germans about where and when the invasion would occur. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Southern England became a vast armed camp, with troops, vehicles, and supplies crowding every available space. Security was intense, with entire counties effectively sealed off and civilian communications restricted. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, was one of the most successful intelligence operations of the war. The Allies created an entirely fictitious 1st United States Army group, supposedly commanded by General Patton, with dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and false information fed through double agents. The Germans were led to believe that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel and the most obvious target. Normandy was presented as either a diversion or a secondary operation. German intelligence took the bait completely. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler and his high command remained convinced for critical hours that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. This deception kept powerful German panzer divisions frozen in place when they might have crushed the invasion in its vulnerable first hours. The selection of Normandy as the landing site was itself a calculated risk. The beaches were less heavily defended than Calais, but they presented significant challenges. The coast was backed by cliffs and hedgerows, terrain that favored defenders. The port facilities were inadequate for supplying a large army, which meant the Allies would need to bring their own harbors in the form of the massive artificial Mulberry harbors. The tidal range was extreme, exposing beach obstacles at low tide but covering them at high tide, creating navigation and landing hazards. Weather in the English Channel was notoriously unpredictable. The operation required specific conditions: a full moon for airborne operations, low tide at dawn to expose beach obstacles, and calm seas for the landing craft. These conditions only occurred a few days each month, creating a narrow window of opportunity. The invasion was originally scheduled for June 5th, but on the evening of June 4th, as troops loaded onto their ships, the weather turned violent. A storm swept through the Channel, making amphibious operations impossible. Eisenhower faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could postpone the invasion, but that meant keeping the secret for weeks longer and maintaining the readiness of hundreds of thousands of men already briefed and prepared. The psychological strain would be enormous. Alternatively, he could wait for a marginal improvement in weather and launch the invasion under less than ideal conditions, risking catastrophic losses. His chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, predicted a brief window of relatively calm weather on June 6th before the storm returned. It was not the weather Eisenhower wanted, but it was the weather he had. After consulting with his senior commanders, Eisenhower made the call. The invasion would proceed on June 6th. "Okay, we'll go," he said simply. The weight of the world rested on those 4 words. The invasion plan called for landings on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. From west to east, they were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces would assault Utah and Omaha. British forces would land at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces would take Juno. Each beach presented unique challenges and would write its own chapter in the story of D-Day. Supporting the beach landings would be massive airborne operations. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop behind Utah Beach to secure causeway exits and disrupt German reinforcements. British 6th Airborne Division would land east of Sword Beach to capture critical bridges and protect the invasion's eastern flank. These paratroopers and glider troops would be the first to land in France, jumping or gliding into darkness hours before the beach landings began. The airborne assault began shortly after midnight on June 6th. Thousands of paratroopers, heavily laden with weapons and equipment, shuffled to the doors of transport aircraft and jumped into the night sky over Normandy. The drops were chaotic. German anti-aircraft fire, poor visibility, pilot inexperience, and high winds scattered the paratroopers across miles of countryside. Units became hopelessly mixed. Officers landed miles from their objectives. Men drowned in flooded fields that the Germans had inundated as a defensive measure. Equipment bundles disappeared into swamps or enemy-held territory. Yet despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the airborne operations achieved their primary objective of creating confusion and disruption. Small groups of paratroopers, often led by junior officers or even sergeants, improvised attacks on German positions, cut communications lines, and spread alarm throughout the German rear areas. The Germans could not determine the scale or location of the airborne assault, which paralyzed their initial response. One of the most famous airborne actions occurred at Pegasus Bridge, a critical crossing over the Caen Canal just east of Sword Beach. British glider troops under Major John Howard landed within yards of the bridge in a textbook operation and captured it in a brief, fierce firefight before the Germans could destroy it. Holding the bridge until relieved by troops from Sword Beach became a desperate defensive battle, but Howard's men succeeded, ensuring that German armor could not use this route to attack the beachhead. Similar small unit actions across the airborne zones disrupted German communications and delayed their reaction to the beach landings. As the first light of dawn broke over the channel on June 6th, the greatest armada in history approached the Normandy coast. Nearly 7,000 vessels of every description crowded the gray waters: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers, and support ships. The sight was awe-inspiring and terrifying. For the men in the landing craft, the approach seemed to take forever. They could see the coastline in the distance, dark and forbidding. Many prayed, some wrote last letters. Others simply stared ahead, minds numb with anticipation and fear. At 6:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers opened fire on German coastal defenses, their heavy guns creating a rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. The earth shook under the bombardment. Simultaneously, waves of Allied bombers attacked German positions, though cloud cover and concerns about hitting the landing forces caused many bombs to fall inland, missing the beach defenses entirely. Utah Beach, the westernmost landing site, was assaulted by the 4th Infantry Division. Through a combination of strong currents and navigation errors, the division landed nearly 2,000 yards south of its intended beach. The mistake proved fortunate. The actual landing site was less heavily defended than the planned beach. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the 56-year-old son of President Theodore Roosevelt, landed with the first wave despite his age and poor health. Walking with a cane, he personally reconnoitered the beach, determined that they had landed in the wrong place, and made the critical decision to revise the plan on the spot. "We'll start the war from right here," he announced. His calm leadership under fire steadied the troops and earned him the Medal of Honor. By the end of the day, Utah Beach was secured with relatively light casualties of fewer than 200 men killed. It was the most successful of the 5 landings. Omaha Beach told a very different story. This beach, assigned to the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, was a killing ground. The Germans had fortified the bluffs overlooking the beach with artillery, machine guns, and mortars in positions that provided overlapping fields of fire across the entire landing area. The naval and air bombardment had been largely ineffective here due to poor visibility and timing errors. The German 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had not been detected by Allied intelligence, was at full strength and readiness. When the first landing craft dropped their ramps at 6:30, the Americans were immediately met with withering fire. Men fell before they could leave the boats. Others drowned when they stepped into deep water, pulled under by heavy equipment. Those who made it onto the beach found themselves pinned down by fire so intense that movement was nearly impossible. The beach became a chaos of dead and wounded men, burning vehicles, and destroyed equipment. For several hours, the situation at Omaha hung in the balance. Officers and men huddled against the seawall at the high tide line, unable to advance across the open beach and up the bluffs. Naval destroyers, seeing the desperate situation, closed to dangerously short range and began firing directly at German positions, their shells screaming just overhead. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and junior officers whose names would mostly be lost to history, began finding gaps in the defenses and working their way up the bluffs. These small unit actions, born of desperation and courage, gradually created openings. Rangers who had assaulted Point Du Hoc to the west, scaling cliffs under fire to destroy artillery positions, now worked their way toward Omaha. By mid-morning, the deadlock began to break. By afternoon, American troops had fought their way off the beach and begun pushing inland. The cost was staggering. Omaha Beach saw over 2,000 American casualties on D-Day, more than all the other beaches combined. But the beach was held and the foothold established. The British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches faced different challenges, but were ultimately more successful in achieving their D-Day objectives. British troops at Gold Beach overcame strong initial resistance and pushed inland, linking up with American forces from Omaha by late afternoon. Canadian forces at Juno Beach fought through fierce resistance in the coastal towns, but advanced further inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day, nearly reaching the outskirts of Caen. British forces at Sword Beach linked up with airborne troops at Pegasus Bridge and established a solid beachhead. Though German counterattacks, particularly by the 21st Panzer Division, prevented them from capturing Caen as planned. The German response to the invasion was confused and fatally delayed. Many senior German commanders, including Rommel, who was responsible for coastal defenses, were away from their posts, believing that the stormy weather made invasion impossible. Hitler himself was asleep, and his staff refused to wake him with news of the landings. When he finally learned of the invasion mid-morning, he still believed it was a diversion and refused to release the panzer reserves needed to drive the Allies back into the sea. By the time German armor began moving toward Normandy in force, the beaches were secured, and Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal for German forces. The critical first day was lost, and with it, any real chance of throwing the invasion back. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, had predicted before D-Day that the invasion would be decided on the beaches in the first 24 hours. "Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive," he told his aide. "For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." Rommel had worked tirelessly to strengthen the Atlantic wall defenses, installing millions of mines, obstacles, and fortifications. But he had been overruled on key strategic questions. He wanted the panzer divisions positioned close to the coast where they could counterattack immediately. His superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, insisted they be held in reserve inland. The compromise satisfied no one and ensured that German armor arrived too late to affect the outcome. Rommel raced back to Normandy on the afternoon of June 6th, but by the time he reached his headquarters, he knew the battle was lost. "The invasion cannot be defeated anymore," he reportedly said. By nightfall on June 6th, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. The foothold was shallow and vulnerable, but it was secure. The Allies had paid a heavy price, with approximately 10,000 casualties, including over 4,000 confirmed dead. But they had achieved the impossible. They had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, established 5 separate beachheads, and begun the liberation of Western Europe. Ships continued to arrive throughout the night, unloading men and supplies in a continuous stream. Engineers worked frantically to clear beach obstacles and create routes off the beaches. Medical personnel tended to thousands of wounded in improvised aid stations. The battle was far from over. Indeed, it was just beginning. The campaign to break out of Normandy would take months and cost tens of thousands more lives. But the critical first step had been taken. The success of D-Day rested on numerous factors coming together at the right moment. The deception plan kept powerful German forces away from Normandy. Allied air superiority prevented the Luftwaffe from interfering significantly with the landings and made it nearly impossible for German reinforcements to move during daylight. The sheer scale of the invasion, with forces landing simultaneously across 50 miles of coastline, overwhelmed German defenders and prevented them from concentrating their response. The courage and initiative of individual soldiers, particularly on Omaha Beach, where small unit leadership saved the day, transformed a potential disaster into a hard-fought success. And the immense logistical achievement of moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tons of supplies across the channel created a momentum that the Germans could not stop. The human dimension of D-Day is what gives the operation its enduring power in historical memory. These were not professional soldiers, for the most part. They were civilians in uniform, young men who had been farmers, factory workers, students, and shopkeepers before the war. They had been drafted or volunteered, trained for months or years, and then thrust into combat of unimaginable intensity. Many performed acts of extraordinary courage, not because they were heroes, but because circumstances demanded it, and they rose to meet those demands. Others broke under the strain, and no one who was not there could judge them. The dead of D-Day lie in cemeteries overlooking the beaches they fought to capture, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David marking lives cut short in the pursuit of a cause larger than themselves. The strategic consequences of D-Day extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The invasion provided hope to occupied Europe that liberation was possible and near. Resistance movements intensified their activities, disrupting German communications and supply lines. The Soviet Union, while publicly dismissive of the scale of the Western effort compared to the Eastern Front, privately welcomed the relief that came from German forces being pulled westward. The invasion forced Hitler into a true two-front war, the nightmare scenario that German strategic planners had sought to avoid since Bismarck's time. German forces that might have reinforced the Eastern Front or defended Italy were instead consumed in the grinding battle for France. The Wehrmacht, already bleeding from years of brutal combat in Russia, now faced simultaneous offensives from east and west that would eventually tear it apart. For the Allied soldiers who survived D-Day and fought through the subsequent Normandy campaign, the experience was transformative and traumatic in equal measure. The hedgerow country of Normandy, with its small fields bounded by earth banks topped with thick vegetation, proved to be ideal defensive terrain. The Battle of Normandy became a grinding attritional struggle that lasted 11 weeks, from D-Day until late August when the Falaise pocket was finally closed. and German forces in Normandy destroyed or driven back toward the German border. American, British, Canadian, Polish, and French forces fought their way forward yard by yard, suffering heavy casualties from German forces that defended with skill and determination born of desperation. The breakout from Normandy, when it finally came in late July with Operation Cobra, unleashed Patton's Third Army in a sweeping advance that liberated much of France in weeks. But this success rested on the foundation laid on June 6th. Without the successful D-Day landings, there would have been no breakout, no liberation of Paris, no race across France to the German border. Every subsequent Allied victory in Western Europe traced its origins back to those desperate hours on the Normandy beaches when the outcome hung in the balance, and men kept moving forward despite fear, despite casualties, despite every rational calculation suggesting they should break and run. The legacy of D-Day extends into the present day. The operation demonstrated that democratic nations, when sufficiently motivated and organized, could mobilize resources and manpower on a scale that matched or exceeded totalitarian powers. The Allied victory in Normandy was a victory not just of arms, but of industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and the ability to coordinate complex operations across national boundaries and service branches. The planning and execution of Overlord set precedents for multinational military operations that continue to influence NATO and other alliance structures today. The beaches of Normandy have become pilgrimage sites, places where people come to remember and honor the sacrifice of those who fought there. The Normandy American Cemetery, with its 9,000 white crosses overlooking Omaha Beach, is a place of profound solemnity where the cost of freedom is made tangible and personal. For the Germans, D-Day marked the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's domination of Europe. From June 6th forward, defeat was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The only questions were how long it would take and how many more would die before the end came. Some German officers recognized this immediately. Rommel, after visiting the Normandy front in the weeks following the invasion, became convinced that Germany had lost the war and began plotting to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. His involvement in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler led to his forced suicide in October 1944. Von Rundstedt was more blunt in his assessment. When asked by Hitler's headquarters what should be done, he allegedly replied, "Make peace, you fools." The weather that had so concerned Eisenhower before the invasion continued to play a role after D-Day. On June 19th, a major storm struck the Normandy coast, damaging or destroying numerous ships and one of the two Mulberry artificial harbors. The storm delayed the buildup of forces and supplies, but by this point the beachhead was secure enough to withstand the setback. The American Mulberry was abandoned, but the British harbor continued to function and the Allies adapted, unloading supplies directly onto the beaches when necessary. The ability to overcome logistical challenges and continue the advance despite setbacks demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that characterized the Allied effort. The human stories that emerged from D-Day are countless and varied. There were acts of heroism, certainly, but also moments of compassion and humanity that transcended the violence. Medics on both sides risked their lives to treat wounded soldiers regardless of nationality. German prisoners were often surprised to be treated humanely by their captors after years of propaganda describing the Allies as barbarians. Allied soldiers, expecting to fight fanatics, found themselves facing ordinary men who were often as scared and miserable as they were. The realization that the enemy was human, not a monster, complicated the moral clarity that made combat psychologically bearable. The story of D-Day also includes the contributions of those who never set foot on the beaches. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who decrypted German Enigma messages, provided intelligence that shaped invasion planning. The workers in American, British, and Canadian factories who built the ships, aircraft, weapons, and supplies that made the invasion possible. The planners and staff officers who solved countless logistical puzzles. The sailors of the merchant marine who transported supplies across the Atlantic despite the threat of U-boats. The women who served as nurses, factory workers, and in support roles. The French resistance fighters who provided intelligence and sabotaged German communications. D-Day was a collective effort involving millions of people, most of whose names are forgotten, but whose contributions were essential. The photographic and film documentation of D-Day created a visual record that has shaped how subsequent generations understand the invasion. Robert Coppa's famous photographs from Omaha Beach, grainy and out of focus due to a processing error, somehow captured the chaos and fear of the landing more powerfully than any perfectly focused image could have. The footage shot by combat cameramen, both during and after the landings, provided evidence of what happened and became the foundation for countless documentaries and films. These images have been reproduced so often that they have become iconic, symbols of courage and sacrifice that transcend their specific historical moment. The memory of D-Day has been contested and reinterpreted over the decades. During the Cold War, Western nations emphasized D-Day as the decisive turning point of the war, sometimes minimizing the Soviet contribution on the Eastern Front. Soviet accounts dismissed D-Day as a minor operation compared to the massive battles fought in Russia. The truth, as usual, is more complex. Both fronts were essential to defeating Nazi Germany. Neither the Soviets nor the Western Allies could have won alone. D-Day and the subsequent campaign in Western Europe forced Germany to fight a two-front war that it could not sustain, while the Eastern Front consumed the majority of German military resources. The two theaters were complementary, not competitive, in their contribution to victory. As the veterans of D-Day aged and began passing away, efforts intensified to record their testimony and preserve their stories. Oral history projects interviewed thousands of veterans, capturing their memories before they were lost forever. These interviews reveal the complexity of the D-Day experience. Some veterans spoke freely about their experiences. Others remained silent for decades, unable or unwilling to revisit memories too painful to share. Some struggled with survivors' guilt, asking why they lived when so many comrades died. Others found meaning in their service and took pride in their contribution to a just cause. There is no single veteran experience, just as there was no single experience of D-Day itself. The lessons of D-Day continue to be studied by military professionals seeking to understand what made the operation successful. The importance of jointness, the coordination of land, sea, and air forces toward a common objective, stands out as a critical factor. The value of deception and intelligence in shaping the enemy's response. The need for detailed planning combined with flexibility to adapt when plans inevitably fail to survive contact with reality. The decisive importance of junior leadership when senior command and control breaks down. The role of logistics in sustaining operations once the initial objectives are achieved. These lessons have been applied with varying degrees of success in subsequent military operations, from the Incheon landing in Korea to the amphibious operations of the Gulf War. The invasion also highlighted the terrible cost of liberation. The French civilians of Normandy, who had lived under German occupation for 4 years, welcomed their liberators but paid a heavy price. Allied bombing and shelling destroyed much of the region's infrastructure and killed thousands of French civilians. The Battle of Normandy turned prosperous farming communities into wastelands of rubble and craters. The city of Caen, a key objective that was not captured until mid-July, was almost completely destroyed. The moral complexity of inflicting such destruction on the people being liberated was not lost on Allied commanders or the soldiers who witnessed it. Liberation was necessary, but it was not clean or simple. The scars, physical and psychological, took decades to heal. The contribution of specific national groups to D-Day deserves recognition. The Canadians who landed at Juno Beach fought with particular distinction, overcoming fierce resistance to advance further inland than any other Allied unit on the first day. The British, despite not capturing all their D-Day objectives, established a solid beachhead and tied down German forces that might otherwise have been thrown against the Americans. The Americans, particularly at Omaha Beach, demonstrated determination and courage in the face of what seemed like certain defeat. The Free French forces, though not part of the initial assault, fought in the subsequent campaign with special intensity, driven by the desire to liberate their homeland. Polish, Norwegian, Belgian, Dutch, and other Allied personnel served in various capacities, making D-Day a truly international effort. The planning for what would happen after D-Day was as important as planning for the invasion itself. The Allies had learned from the experience of the First World War and were determined to avoid a repeat of the trench warfare stalemate. This required maintaining momentum, exploiting success, and having sufficient resources to sustain continuous operations. The logistics tale for the invasion was staggering, requiring careful coordination of shipping, port operations, supply distribution, and maintenance. The creation of the Mulberry Harbors and Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean that pumped fuel from England to France, demonstrated innovative problem-solving on a massive scale. These logistical achievements received less attention than the dramatic beach landings, but they were equally essential to the operation's success. The story of D-Day is ultimately a story about ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things under extreme circumstances. The 19-year-old private in a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, terrified but moving forward because that was what was expected. The naval officer guiding his ship through the channel in darkness, knowing that a navigation error could doom hundreds. The pilot flying through anti-aircraft fire to drop paratroopers in the right location. The engineer diffusing mines under fire so that tanks could move off the beach. The medic treating wounded men while shells exploded nearby. The staff officer who had spent months planning for this moment and could only watch and hope that the plan would work. Each played a role, and each role mattered. The success of D-Day changed the trajectory of the Second World War and, by extension, shaped the world we live in today. A failed invasion would have prolonged the war, potentially by years. It might have allowed Germany to concentrate forces against the Soviet Union or to deploy new weapons like jets and rockets in decisive numbers. It would have undermined Allied unity and possibly led to a negotiated peace that left Nazi Germany in control of much of Europe. The successful invasion ensured that Nazi Germany would be defeated totally, not merely contained. It determined that Western Europe would be liberated by democratic powers rather than occupied by the Soviet Union. The political map of post-war Europe was drawn by the positions of Allied and Soviet armies when the war ended, and those positions were determined in large part by the success of the Normandy invasion. If this profound exploration into the most consequential day of the Second World War has given you a deeper understanding of what was at stake, what was sacrificed, and why D-Day continues to matter more than 80 years after the event, then I encourage you to continue this journey through history with us. Here at WW2 War Rewind, we are dedicated to bringing you meticulously researched, deeply engaging documentaries that illuminate the real events and real people who shaped the war that defined the 20th century. Subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss future documentaries exploring the battles, decisions, and human stories that determined the outcome of World War II. We release new content regularly, each piece crafted with the same commitment to historical accuracy, narrative power, and respect for those who lived through these events. Join our community of history enthusiasts by hitting that subscribe button, and let's continue exploring together the most important chapter in modern history. Thank you for spending this time with WW2 War Rewind, where we believe that understanding the past is essential to understanding ourselves.